This is 5.4 part 1 and it is on factoring trinomials. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is factoring equations that are in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. And we're actually going to start out with ones that are just x squared plus bx plus c to make it a little easier. So let's do a little reminder to ourselves and look at what happens when we multiply a binomial times a binomial. Pause if you need some time to get all of that written down. So we're going to look at what happens if we multiply two really simple polynomials like x plus 3 times x plus 5. So remember, if we were just going to distribute here, we have to do this first term times both of the terms in the second set. So we do x times x is x squared, x times 5 is 5x, and then we have to multiply the second term, 3, by both terms in the other parentheses. So 3 times x is 3x, and 3 times 5 is 15. If we simplify that, we've got x squared plus 8x, to combine those two terms, plus 15. So when we look at that, we've got, this is our expanded form, and here, or sorry, factored form here, and our expanded form here. So what we're going to be doing today is I'm going to give you the expanded form and we're going to go back to the factored form. So let's look at, if we are given the expanded form, where we get the numbers in the factored form. So we're trying to see how we get a 5 and a 3 from this. So the way we see that is that 5 times 3 is 15 and 5 plus 3 is 8. And that's the pattern we're going to be looking at this entire time. This will probably make a little more sense when we do an example. So let's try an example. So our first example is going to be to factor the trinomial x squared plus 9x plus 8. So as soon as you see a trinomial in this form, x squared plus something x plus something, you want to just open up two sets of parentheses, and we're going to have a binomial in each of these. So we're going to try and find something times something that equals x squared plus 9x plus 8. We're trying to go backwards here. Like, what did we start off with that when we multiplied it, we got x squared plus 9x plus 8? So what we want to do here is we know that our first term is going to be an x squared. So we need this times this to give us the x squared. So x times x is x squared. Whoops. And that's what you're going to always start off with until we get to more complicated problems. Then we have to figure out what to put in these two spots. So when you're thinking about what to put in those two spots, here is what you're looking for. We're going to find two numbers that multiply to 8, because of that 8 right there, and they have to add up to 9 because of the 9 right there. And later we're going to be referring to this last term as C and this middle term as B. So we're trying to find two numbers that multiply to C and add to B. So let's look at all the numbers that do multiply to 8. So if I'm going to write 8 over here, I know that I can do 1 times 8 or 2 times 4. So now what we're doing is looking through those numbers and we're trying to find a pair of those that also add up to 9. Well, 2 plus 4 is not 9, it's 6, and 8 plus 1 does equal 9. So this is the pair we want to use, which means that 1 and 8 are the numbers that we want to fill in right here. Positive 1 and positive 8 multiply up to 8, and positive 1 plus 8 is 9. So this is our answer for our factored form, x plus 1 times x plus 8. If we multiply it out, it should get us what we were given, x squared plus 9x plus 8. Now we can always check. And to check, we're going to take the answer we got and try multiplying it out to see if we get what we started with. So x times x is x squared, x times 8 is 8x, 1 times x is 1x, and 1 times 8 is 8. This simplifies to x squared plus 9x plus 8, which if I scroll up, That's what I was given, x squared plus 9x plus 8. So I know my solution was right. So my solution is x plus 1 times x plus 8. I'm going to give you guys one that I want you to try, and we'll go over it tomorrow. So I want you to try factoring the polynomial x squared plus 5x plus 6. So you're going to find out what goes in those two sets of parentheses. All right, let's try one where we put in some negatives here. So in this next example, we're going to factor the trinomial y squared minus 9y plus 20. So we're trying to do the same thing here. We're going to put this into two binomials that when multiplied will get us what we started with. We know our first term in each one's going to be y because y times y will get us that first term, y squared. Now for our last term, we're looking for two numbers that multiply to c, which is 20, and they need to add to our b value, which is negative 9. So they need to multiply to 20 and add up to negative 9. And that's kind of a weird little symbol, but that's how you can remember it. It has to multiply to 20, add up to negative 9. So I think the easiest way to start with this is to look at the numbers that multiply to 20. 1 times 20, 2 times 10, and 4 times 5. I think that's about it. So if we add those numbers up, 1 and 20, that gets us 21, not 9. If we add 2 and 10, that's 12, when we're looking for negative 9. 4 and 5 is positive 9, but I really wanted to get a negative 9 when I added them up. So what we can do is we can play with the signs here a little bit. Now we still want them to multiply to a positive 20 because my C term is a positive 20. But remember that if we do a negative times a negative, it will also give us negative 20. A positive 20. Scratch that. Negative times negative is positive. So if I do negative 4 and negative 5, that multiplies to positive 20. And if I add those up, negative 4 plus negative 5 gets me that negative 9 that I wanted. So it fulfills both of those requirements. They multiply to positive 20, and negative 4 and negative 5 add up to negative 9. So what I'm going to put in my parentheses here is negative 4 and negative 5. And that should be my factored form. Remember, we can always check it. We can do y times y is y squared minus 5y minus 4y plus 20. And if I combine those two terms, I get negative 9y, which is what I started with up here. So I know my answer is correct. I want you guys to try one. I want you to try to factor x squared minus 7x plus 12. So really pay attention to your positive and negative values there. All right, I have two more examples. The first one we're going to do is we're going to factor a trinomial, x to the 3 minus x squared minus 30x. So when you look at this, you might be thinking, well, this doesn't look like the ones we've done so far today. The ones we've done so far today always start with an x squared. So what you want to do is always, 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 whenever you're factoring any problem, because we're going to do tons of factoring, your first step is always to factor out any common factors. So if all three terms have something you can factor out, you want to go ahead and pull that out. So if I look at these three terms, I see that they all have an x that I can pull out and put in front here. So I'm going to pull that x out in front and write what I'm left with. So my first term was x3. I took an x. I'm left with x squared. My second term was negative x squared. I took out one of those x's, so I'm just left with 1. And then my last term was negative 30x, so I'm just left with the negative 30. The x got taken away. Now, if you want, in that trinomial right there, you can put that 1 in front of the x. It just might make it a little easier to think about. Because what we did is we factored part of it, but I think we can still factor what is in those parentheses. I think we can still factor this part. So what we're going to do is we already factored out that x, but he's still part of our problem because we still need him to be part of that multiplying if we were going back to what we started with. So we're going to put the x on the outside, and then we can open up some parentheses to try and factor this part right here, the x squared minus 1x minus 30. So remember that we're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add to negative 1. So since we're multiplying up to a negative here, I know it's going to have to be one positive number and one negative number. That's the only way to get a negative when you're multiplying. A positive times a negative gets you a negative. So let's look at numbers that multiply to 30. 1 times 30, 2 times 15, 3 times 10, 5 times 6, and then I think it starts over 6 times 5, 10 times 3. You don't have to write the duplicates down. Doesn't matter which order we multiply. So remember, one of these numbers is going to have to be negative and the other is going to have to be positive to make them multiply to negative 30. So you want to go through those and try and find one where if you made one of the numbers negative and add them up, it would add up to negative 1 because that's our B term. That's our middle term. They have to add up to negative 1. So the one I'm seeing that would work is 5 and 6. If we do 5 times negative 6, that multiplies to negative 30, and 5 plus negative 6 adds up to negative 1. So I know that in those parentheses, I'm going to have an x to start off with to get us that x squared as the first term, and I'm going to have a plus 5 and a minus 6 because I used positive 5 and negative 6. Now we're definitely done factoring. There's nothing else we can multiply there. And I'm not going to check this one, but if you went ahead and multiplied it back out, we should end up with exactly what we started with. X to the 3 minus x squared minus 30x. Actually, I am going to do this on this one because I think it's a good one to do. So if we were going to check this, let's write it down. Write it down. We're going to do x times x is x squared. X times negative 6 is negative 6x. Then we have to do the 5 times the x and the 5 times the negative 6. So I multiplied back out those parts in green. Now remember that all still has this x on the outside. You have to bring it down. So if I'm going to multiply this out now, let's go ahead and combine these terms. Negative 6x plus 5x is negative 1x. So I've got x squared minus 1x minus 30. So far that's a good sign because this looks like this, what I had in the middle of my step. And then if I distributed this x out, I have x to the 3 minus 1x squared minus 30x. And that is exactly what I started with in the very beginning, right here. So if I multiply back out my factored form, I should get what I started with. Let's try one more example. Oh, no, sorry, two more, but one of them is very short. And we're going to have to factor out a common factor again. So in this one, we're going to factor 2x squared plus 34x minus 220. So if we look at all those three terms, I can see that they're all even, so I can pull a 2 out of all of those. So we're going to factor a 2 out of everything first because we always want to factor out a common factor of all terms if possible first. It'll always make it easier. So now we're left with just x squared plus 17x, because 34 divided by 2 is 17, minus 110, because I did negative 220 divided by that positive 2. So now we want to keep this 2 on the outside, but we want to try and factor this trinomial right here into two binomials. So I know I'm going to have x first in each one because I need to get x squared. And now we're looking for two numbers that multiply to negative 110 and add to positive 17. So let's look at the factors of 110. There's a lot. We could do 1 times 110. We could do 2 times 55. We could do, let's see, what else goes in there? 5 times 22. We could do 10 times 11. And I think I'm already seeing one that gets me a 17 somehow. So remember, I'm really trying to multiply to a negative 110. So I want one positive number and one negative. I know I want one positive, one negative to get me that negative 110. So I'm also looking for one that'll get me a positive 17 if I add them. So I think if I use 5 and 22, I can get 17. Because if I do 22 minus 5, or 22 plus negative 5, that'll get me 17, and negative 5 times 22 is negative 110. So in our parentheses here, we're going to have x plus 22 and x minus 5. And that should be our factored form. This one I won't go through and check, but remember that you always could to make sure you got it correct. All right, I have one last example for us. We're going to try and factor x squared minus x plus 7. Remember, that's really like a minus 1x if you wanted to write that out. So to factor this, we're looking for two numbers that will multiply to 7 and add to negative 1. So let's look at numbers that multiply to 7. I think it's just 1 and 7. That's it. Now, I have to get a positive 7, and there's no way to take a 1 and a 7 and add up to negative 1. Doesn't matter which one you make positive or negative, they're never going to add up to negative 1. So what you say if this happens is you just say this is prime. This polynomial right here is prime. That means it has no factors other than 1. All right, come to class with those ones that I asked you to try done, and we will discuss them.